This week, a major corruption scandal engulfing ministers at the heart of the Ukrainian government. Just months after nationwide protests over controversial reforms to Ukraine's anti-corruption authorities, those same bodies have now released new bombshell allegations of an embezzlement scheme surrounding the country's energy sector. They say secret audio recordings reveal a $100 million operation of kickbacks and money laundering. And despite President Zelensky calling for the dismissal of high-profile allies, the involvement of some of his past associates has put the president on a defensive footing. So how damaging could these revelations be? And are more heads set to roll?
Hi, I'm Vitaly Shevchenko.
Hi, I'm Olga Robinson.
Hello, I'm James Waterhouse.
Our panel are here to answer that question and many of the others you've sent us this week on this edition of Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
Well, before we get to our questions, let's start with this absolutely massive news out of Ukraine this week, this corruption scandal that really is engulfing some incredibly senior figures in government, as well as President Zelensky. What's going on, Vitaly?
So the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU, is saying that the Ukrainian nuclear energy company, Energoatom, was involved in a kickbacks scheme where its contractors were not paid until they handed over between 10 and 15% of the contract value to these corrupt people. The essence is that several former and current members of the Ukrainian government, as well as a businessman named Timur Mindich, who is reported to be a close friend of President Zelensky's, are involved in a corruption scandal, a massive corruption scheme focusing on Ukrainian nuclear energy. And the impact can be devastating for both the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian society. Now, what makes it really, really important is that at a time of war, when Ukraine is fighting for its survival, people close to the government and allegedly members of the government have been enriching themselves on a massive, massive scale. So because this alleged friend of Volodymyr Zelensky is involved, what does the Ukrainian president say? He's saying now that he fully supports this probe and those guilty must be punished. But let's not forget that back in July this year, Volodymyr Zelensky signed an order significantly reducing the authority of this anti-corruption bureau, NABU. So questions are being asked. It's still a developing story, but this is not a good look for Ukraine.
We should also point out that many of those involved are denying at the moment these allegations. But James, I've been speaking to Ukrainian MPs this week who say that Ukrainians are not just angry about this, they're really upset, they're hurt, actually, that this has gone on.
Yeah, I mean, the reasons are obvious, right? As Vitaly was saying, here we have another winter where the country's infrastructure is getting pounded, where people are subjected to no heating and no light. You have Ukraine that needs the billions of dollars worth of aid that it receives and therefore is subject to a higher level of scrutiny than it otherwise would be. And you have, once again, a case of corruption where the sums of money, in this case it's around $100 million, they're just huge. And these corruption agencies, Zelensky tried to clip their wings, make them report to him directly. He had to U-turn on that after some pretty unimpressed reactions from his European allies. And for the feeling I get, I'm going to be messaging colleagues and friends this morning, they are furious. But there was also that background acknowledgement that this did go on. So there is some reassurance in that Zelensky has had to go public about this. But it's what is unusual about this are the figures involved. Mr. Mindich is widely seen to be the architect behind this. He clearly wields influence over some very powerful people at ministerial level.
President Zelensky used Mindich's car, and in 2021, the year before the invasion, Volodymyr Zelensky celebrated his birthday in Mindich's flat.
Yeah, they're friends. They're not just, they're called allies, but actually what you're saying is it's more than that.
It goes tighter than that. And, you know, the question marks in Ukraine are, well, who else did know? Did Zelensky's chief of staff know, Andriy Yermak? You know, there are ties to his old production company that Mr. Mindich has ownership of. This is about going back to Zelensky's life before becoming Ukraine's leader.
I mean, it's a massive gift to the Russian propaganda because any major corruption scandal in Ukraine will be latched onto and used as justification for continuing and to delegitimize the authorities in Ukraine further.
James, of course, the reforms were overturned, but it does raise this question. What was known about all of this when the reforms were proposed?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of things bubbling around, Lucy, and actually in Ukraine, it has come a long way in battling corruption, but it has still got a long way to go. It is still a young country that has spent a large proportion of its independence since the collapse of the Soviet Union at war. So reforms and the establishing of these independent bodies and the government mechanisms to make sure public money is put in the right place, they are still evolving. But there is a separate case that Mr. Mindich is connected to about the procurement of dodgy body armour for soldiers that was manufactured in China. They failed military tests. A former deputy prime minister, Alexei Chernyshov, I used to chat to in the gym, and he's connected to a separate corruption probe earlier in the summer. I've DM'd him about these latest allegations facing him. Mr. Mindich, we understand, has legged it to Israel ahead of these findings coming out. And so, look, these scandals, when they do come out, Zelensky goes public straight away. You feel he has to, but it's the sums of money. And there was a recording released by the anti-corruption agency of key figures allegedly counting the cash and putting it in a kit bag. You know, it's the level at which individuals try to enrich themselves, which is always the most shocking. And you know, there is never a good time for Ukraine.
And the sums of money involved at a time where people are cold and in darkness and cannot heat their homes.
Yeah. Energoatom, the nuclear agency in question, supplies more than half of Ukraine's electricity currently. After certain Russian air raids, this share rises to 70%. So it's impossible to overestimate the importance of this agency that's right at the heart of this massive corruption scandal.
Yeah. And we should once again point out at the moment these are allegations that are being denied. But let's move on to some of the great questions we've had this week and turn to the frontline situation in eastern Ukraine and hear our first question.
Hello, this is Michael calling from Bricket Wood, St Albans. My question is, could Ukraine target the supply routes to Russian forces and cut them off? Thanks.
Well, they're already doing it. And we have seen even this year, time and time again, video emerge that we've verified, particularly from southern Russia, where logistical hubs, railway stations and substations that are important for military logistics for the Russian army have been targeted by Ukrainian drones. So this does happen, but obviously it's a different kind of scale. The issue of cutting off all supply routes, because Russia has a vast amount of them, and they obviously rely on the railways a lot for it. And Russia inherited from the Soviet Union a vast network of railway, but they're also building new railway from Rostov region in the south all the way to the occupied Ukraine, and they're hoping to kind of stretch it all the way to Crimea, bypassing the Kerch Bridge. Now, Ukraine has been even earlier in the war targeting logistics that were going through the Crimean Bridge. And the problem with that is that it did cause temporary issues with supplies, but then the Russians found another way of supplying their troops. So they're no longer relying as much on the Crimean Bridge. So the Kerch Bridge, they're going kind of bypass it through the railways.
But at the moment, Olga, what they're actually trying to do is improve the network. They're not just trying to maintain current levels.
Yeah, they are. They are trying to, because in the kind of the view of the Russian authorities, they are in the occupied territories for good. And there's like a way for them to expand, make their logistics better, and stay here for as long as they can.
And the thing about targeting supply lines, it's an ongoing thing in war. You don't sort of take out on railway and cripple the enemy's capability to fight. Ukraine has had some successes with the way it's forced Russia's Black Sea naval fleet back from Crimea, and it is by boat that is the most effective way to shift soldiers and equipment. But I think at this stage of the war, we're seeing both sides provide supplies on a much smaller scale, little and often, which is reflective of the battle going on behind the front lines.
Every time on the pod that we speak about a potential negotiated end to the war, this issue of the occupied territory comes up. And that is the subject of our next question, which comes from Terry in Cornwall, who says, why doesn't the US and or the EU simply ask those living in the Donbas, do you want to be Russian or Ukrainian? Following the results, those who wish to be Russian or Ukrainian could migrate to their chosen area. Vitaly.
Terry, it's an excellent idea, but in an ideal world, in the tragic reality of war-torn Ukraine, I'm really not sure it's going to work. And there are practical and historical reasons why I say that. The practical reasons are focused on how do you vote when you're being bombed and targeted by Russia's human safari, where they use drones against whoever happens to be in the street. Historical reasons are that, well, events similar to votes, they have been attempted in Ukraine already, in Russia-occupied parts of Ukraine, where in September 2022, they held votes on whether to join Russia. And then in March 2024, there was a presidential election, and I'm using that phrase in quote marks, held by Russia in occupied parts of Ukraine. And in both cases, it was anything but a free and fair election. People were forced to vote at gunpoint, literally. They didn't have to go to polling stations. Ballot boxes were delivered to their houses, accompanied by men with machine guns. Secrecy of the vote, forget it. And also, let's not discount the massive propaganda campaign waged by Russia. The Kremlin has a track record of manipulating votes, and in areas that it occupies completely, their control of that process is complete as well. Now, who is going to vote in these referendums as well? People who came from Russia, who were brought from Russia, Ukrainians who were forced to take Russian passports, Ukrainians who've had to flee, and also the first vote that happened in that part of Ukraine to do with Ukraine's independence was in 1991, and 83%, in fact, of residents of Luhansk and Donetsk regions voted in favor of Ukraine's independence. So it's kind of happened before.
Also, to just echo what Vitaly was saying, the sheer atmosphere of fear in the occupied Ukraine, whenever you do manage to get hold of someone who there, and even if they agree to speak to you anonymously, they only can speak to you at night. They can only they call you when they can talk, and you have to just sit there by your phone expecting a call from them, and they abruptly have to end their conversation because they're worried that somebody might overhear. And it's just, this is the kind of atmosphere we're talking about in occupied territories.
So the idea that you could have a referendum that was in any way
and speak freely, it really is quite difficult to see it.
Okay, well, let's turn now to something I'm sure you're all asked about all the time, which is conscription, because I think people think about it with how Ukraine is coping with the war when they try and visualize what is actually happening there and how people are feeling. David in Hull has asked, when are Ukraine going to drop the age of conscription down to 18? The same as in the West. I don't know what he means by the West actually here, Dave, because lots of Western countries don't have conscription anymore. But if we do think back, James, to say World War II, that began at 18. And I think a lot of people think of young men going off to fight.
Yeah, and so does Donald Trump. Remember he was earlier in the year saying to Zelensky, well, you want me to help you as much as I can. Why don't you lower the conscription age to 18 from 25? And what Zelensky says is that he has to preserve the future of his country, he has to leave it in some kind of a better condition for future generations. We've seen the population shrink over the last decade of war by about 10 million. We've got a low birth rate. We've got short of a third of the population at retirement age. These things will catch up with you. And so, when you look at the forecast death tolls on both sides, the number of men who have died, or the ones you see in rehabilitation centres with life-changing injuries, men in their 20s and 30s, you realise that you are, talking about men in their prime who would otherwise be working and contributing to the economy. And these are very difficult equations that Zelensky has to try and work out in his head.
Another point that Zelensky made was that the West, give us better weapons, more weapons, that will save our young people's lives. But part of me, James, thinks that the Ukrainian authorities would probably want to start mobilizing younger people because it would help with the war effort. The big question is also whether they'll be able to carry out that campaign given the huge controversy that surrounds the current mobilization effort starting from the age of 25. And last month we saw protests in Odessa where people who don't want to be mobilized, they overturned a van driven by those military conscription officers. So there's what the government may want to do and also what they will be able to do.
There's no doubt politically it's more difficult than it is militarily. Of course, if you have young men in 18, they're easy to mould, they're in peak physical condition, and they're highly motivated. And you meet these guys all the time, who and they do make up. It's why armies recruit
and they
people
volunteer
at 18, and they volunteer and they're motivated. But it's not as if you do. Say you broadened mobilisation. Ukraine has a big push. And as widely forecast, even with current levels of military help, they don't liberate the territory they'd like. The war grinds to one of attrition again. The West loses interest because Ukraine gave it all they could. Then you really have scuppered yourself by putting an even younger cohort at risk.
That's an excellent question, because this is the kind of suggestion that keeps coming up in Ukraine. Just earlier this week, I think, Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, he said, well, why don't we drop conscription age from 25 to 23 or 22 possibly. So this idea is in the air, I think.
It's interesting also, this issue is of interest to pro-Russian actors online because, like, literally, I think a few days ago we were looking at an AI video that went viral that showed a crying 23-year-old soldier that was allegedly being sent to Chasiv Yar, but it was AI generated and came from an account that was constantly creating videos like that. But it was interesting how they were trying to weigh in on that particular issue of conscription age and the person allegedly being 23.
There's always a lot of speculation about the relationship between Donald Trump and President Putin and what the future of US and Russian cooperation might look like. John in Somerset has been in touch with just that kind of a question, where he asks, I've been watching Once Upon a Time in Space on TV about the collaboration between Russia and the USA in developing the International Space Station in the 1980s and 90s. So my question is, are there any cooperation programs between the USA and Russia that exist today? Vitaly.
As far as we can tell, some sort of security cooperation. Some channels are still open between American and Russian security agencies, just in case something big happens or something big is about to happen. So in the past, they've tipped each other off. But I think it's correct to say that space cooperation is the most visible, the most obvious joint project that's still happening between America and Russia. For example, in July, the head of Russia's space agency, Roscosmos, Dmitry Bakanov, he visited Cape Canaveral in Florida, where he met his counterpart from NASA, and they discussed the future of the International Space Station. So this is still happening, but apart from this, I can't really think of anything, major that's still going on. Least of all, cooperation in stopping arms from proliferating. That is in a bad shape right now.
We haven't spoken much recently about public opinion outside of Ukraine when it comes to the war. So let's have a listen to our next question.
Hi, Ukrainecast. This is Bart. I'm a Canadian living here in Austria for over 10 years. Is the main reason why Western countries will not stand up more strongly to Russia simply that there is no support for doing that in the populations? Since in my experience, I don't see this level of support very much, and I find it frustrating personally.
James, perhaps this is one for you because it's interesting. We've got some data and some polling, but also because you're outside of Ukraine now and what you've experienced personally.
Yeah, I mean, here in the UK, there is still cross-party support for Ukraine, and the UK, to simplify, is just doing what it can, but it's always dwarfed by what America can. In America, there is more support for Ukraine than Donald Trump's White House, although it has waned over time, not least with the conflict in the Middle East, which also diverts attentions. It is an inescapable fact that the war in Ukraine and other conflicts are hard to follow, and I'm sure people still felt the core sentiments they felt in the early weeks and months, a story of oppressed versus oppressor, an embattled democracy against an autocracy. But time is not your friend if you're looking to kind of sustain that campaign and secure, if you're Ukraine, secure Western help that is so fraught with unpredictability.
I think there are two main reasons why the West isn't standing up strongly, whatever we put into that definition of strongly, to Russia, which are the West doesn't feel threatened enough by Russia, and secondly, the West doesn't value Ukraine enough to start sending its own people to fight in Ukraine, possibly be killed in Ukraine, to start sending more weapons to Ukraine, possibly provoke Putin, the dreaded P word.
Well, it's an American question. It's not a case of, I don't believe it's a case of not believing in Ukraine. If you were to do a straw poll outside this studio, I'm sure you wouldn't hear anyone say, let them fight it out and gradually lose over time. It's the fact that no European ally, or any other, in fact, is willing to put one of their soldiers in Ukraine,
absolutely,
and risk an escalation.
Yeah. I mean, I've got some polling figures in front of me. In the US, 72% of respondents support Trump sanctioning Russian oil and gas to force a ceasefire, for instance. In the UK, 59% support the UK's current economic, humanitarian and military assistance. In Europe, it's 76% agree that Europe should provide financial and humanitarian support to Ukraine. What is interesting, the support is strong right across the board, but there's a variation on what that actually means. So lots of people say they support Ukraine up until the point of a ceasefire rather than total victory. What does that look like? So that's where you start to see a bit of a difference.
It's interesting, yeah. And it's not as simple as the war just ending, is it?
Absolutely.
And Ukraine can get on with it.
Thank you all. James, good to see you. Olga, Vitaly, and thank you so much for watching. We'll be back with a new Q&A episode next week. In the meantime, don't forget you can check out our Ukrainecast feed wherever you get your BBC podcasts for plenty more. But for now, goodbye from the team.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.